I call the member for Bradfield.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to speak on the Clean Energy Bill 2011 and the enormous package of related bills. Bills which break a promise to the Australian people by imposing a fixed price tax on carbon starting at $23 per tonne from the 1st of July 2012 and rising at 2.5% per annum in real terms. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to make three key points in relation to these bills. First, that they constitute bad faith and bad process. Secondly, that Australia should not be acting in advance of world agreement, and that Labor has committed Australia to a poor bargaining position. And thirdly, that this is a poorly designed tax and its internal logic is deeply flawed. Let me turn first to the question of bad faith and bad process. This government, Madam Deputy Speaker, has no mandate to bring these bills before the Parliament. A change of this magnitude is being imposed without any support having been secured from the Australian people in a general election. That of itself would be troubling enough. But in fact, the Prime Minister went to the last election with an explicit commitment that her government would not make this change. We all recall her infamous statement, "There will be no carbon tax under the government that I lead." The 2010 election, Madam Deputy Speaker, was decided by a very close margin. One might with some confidence have predicted a different result if the Prime Minister had been frank about her government's intention to introduce a carbon tax if elected. Given that this policy was not presented to the people of Australia at the last election, these reforms should not be implemented until a mandate is obtained from the Australian people in either a general election or through a plebiscite. Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, Labor's position on this issue has moved all over the shop. Who could forget Prime Minister Gillard's extraordinary proposal to convene a citizens' assembly to consider the pricing of carbon? And who could forget that during the election campaign the Prime Minister spoke of the need to develop, quotes, deep and lasting, close quotes, community consensus on climate change? Is it really possible that our Prime Minister stated that this was a requirement, community consensus, for deep and lasting community consensus, when you see the position that this government is now adopting, seeking to ram through one of the most significant structural changes to Australia's taxation and public policy regime in our history without any community consensus, let alone a deep and lasting one, instead as a result of an illegitimate and fragile consensus of a collection of independents joined with the government. Let me turn to the second point I wish to make, Madam Deputy Speaker, that Australia should not be acting in the manner that the Labor government proposes to commit us to act, because to do so involves us adopting a very bad bargaining position. The internal logic for the approach that Labor is following makes no sense. Let's start with the proposition that if it is to be worthwhile, a carbon tax must be about more than just reducing emissions in Australia. The policy objective is a global one, to stabilise and reduce the total worldwide emissions of greenhouse gases. In 2008, around 30,000 million tonnes of carbon dioxide were emitted due to human activity. If the carbon tax achieves its intended result in Australia, it will reduce emissions by 160 million tonnes, a drop in the ocean compared to the global task. Therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, the only basis on which the carbon tax could make sense is if it were an effective strategy for encouraging global action. Australia is at a bargaining table with nearly 200 other parties, and each party faces conflicting incentives. On the one hand, the internal logic of the carbon tax is that each party would benefit from a global reduction in emissions and consequently a reduction in the risk of dangerous warming. So runs the internal logic of the policy which is put to us. But, on the other hand, each country faces economic and other costs in acting to reduce emissions at home. Therefore, if a country chooses to incur these costs, it is taking a risk that it might incur them yet secure no benefit, because other countries do not keep their side of the deal. Madam Deputy Speaker, as you would be aware, this is a well-known type of problem in economics and business strategy, and there is a whole body of thinking, game theory, about the right strategies to be used in dealing with these kinds of problems. The classic problem is called the prisoner's dilemma. What we have in this case with climate change is what theorists would call an N-person, multi-round prisoner's dilemma. Madam Deputy Speaker, as an individual country considers whether or not to incur the costs of reducing carbon emissions in its own economy, it faces a choice. In the jargon of game theory, it can cooperate. That is to say, it can take action to reduce emissions and incur the costs of doing so. Or, again to use the jargon, it can defect, in other words, fail to take such action. Now, the critical point I want to make, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that game theory offers some clear lessons for countries approaching this bargaining table. Firstly, it is both pointless and dangerous to unilaterally choose the option which delivers the outcome which is considered optimal overall. You face a substantial risk that other players will defect, in turn leaving you worse off. I would submit, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this is precisely what the Labor Party is doing by seeking to impose a tax in Australia regardless of what the rest of the world does. Secondly, if you are going to cooperate towards achieving what you determine to be the best overall objective, you need to find a way to strike an enforceable bargain. A key finding of game theory is that in a multi-round game you can use your choices to communicate and enforce such a bargain. The standard advice is to cooperate in the first round and keep cooperating in subsequent rounds if the other player does the same. But if the other player does not cooperate in a given round, the rational course of action is to respond in the next round by defecting yourself. This logic, Madam Deputy Speaker, the logic of considering carefully how we approach a global bargaining table so as to secure the best outcome, having regard to the individual incentives of the players at the table, is the logic that underlines or is consistent with the approach of the Coalition's Direct Action Plan. Under our plan, Australia will take action to reduce carbon emissions at significant economic cost, in fact $3.2 billion of on-budget expenditure over 4 years. Under this plan, we will reduce carbon emissions in 2020 to the same target as Labor has adopted, a 5% reduction on the year 2000, or approximately 530 million tonnes. As the member for Goldstein has recently pointed out, at that point we can then determine the way forward. He had this to say: if there is still no global agreement by 2020, Australia will have remained competitive while reducing emissions by 5%, avoided tens of billions of tax, yet still be in a good position to assess the way forward from there. I would argue, Madam Deputy Speaker, that our policy can be thought of as pursuing a rational strategy in a multi-round game, to cooperate if others cooperate, but not to bind ourselves unilaterally to acting unless we can be satisfied that others are also so acting. Some, of course, say we should act regardless of what the rest of the world does, and that essentially is the strategy underpinning the Labor Party's and the Greens' carbon tax. The insights of game theory, Madam Deputy Speaker, suggest it is a poor strategy and a naive way to approach the global bargaining table. Let me turn to my third point, which is that the tax that the House is considering this morning is a badly designed one, even by reference to the principles laid down by the so-called Multi-Party Committee on Climate Change. Indeed, it is a bad tax by an even more fundamental criterion, the basic tax policy criterion of certainty. We still do not know which companies are going to pay the tax. Which are the 500 companies that will be legally liable to pay this tax? All we keep hearing is the continued rhetoric of the 500 biggest polluters. On a very basic level, certainty in tax policy is an absolute requirement, and this government has failed to provide that certainty. Let me turn to referring to the 11 principles which supposedly guided the Multi-Party Committee on Climate Change, including economic efficiency, budget neutrality, the competitiveness of Australian industries, energy security and investment security. This package, Madam Deputy Speaker, fails to achieve many of these principles. Let us consider investment certainty, for example. The caps to apply after 2015 have not been set and will be set in the future not by legislation but by regulation. There is no certainty as to what ultimately will be Australia's emissions reduction target for 2020 if the 5% level is changed, and there is uncertainty about the level of the carbon price once the fixed price phase ends. The level of uncertainty which this in turn creates for business will negatively impact business decisions and investment and will harm the economy and growth to the detriment of all Australians. We were also told that one of the guiding principles was budget neutrality. Madam Deputy Speaker, that principle is also being violated by the tax which is embodied in the package of legislation the House of Representatives is considering today. The policy scheme will result in a deficit exceeding $3 billion over the forward estimates period. What of the criterion of international competitiveness? On this front, there is a critical issue about which sectors qualify as trade exposed. The Minerals Council, in its submission, made the point that only 60% of Australian firms are classified as trade exposed. Those which are not so classified face very significant adverse consequences for their international competitiveness. We are also told that one of the principles which applied in designing this scheme was energy security. Once again, this package manifestly fails to live up to that principle. There is some $5.5 billion in compensation to be paid, but almost all of that will go to private sector generators in Victoria and South Australia and almost none to the publicly owned generators in New South Wales, Queensland and Western Australia. This inconsistency of treatment is unfair to the owners of generators in New South Wales, Queensland and Western Australia and would be unfair to them regardless of their ownership. Because, as it happens, they are government-owned, it is also unfair to the taxpayers who are their underlying owners, and of course it is in turn unfair to their customers who are likely to be subject to higher electricity prices. Let me conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, with a fundamental and overarching criticism of the policy design in this scheme, yet another of the inherent logical inconsistencies in what the House is considering. The underlying theory behind a carbon pricing mechanism, such as the one contained in this package of bills, is to increase the relative price of carbon-intensive goods and services. That is, a carbon tax is meant, as we are told frequently, to unleash the price signal by increasing the relative price of goods with a high proportion of carbon relative to goods with a lower proportion of carbon. In this context, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is very puzzling that the Prime Minister has threatened businesses with fines from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission should they increase prices in response to higher cost inputs due to the carbon tax, and she has stated that an increase of more than 0.7% would be gouging. This undermines the fundamental objective of the scheme. If the tax is meant to provide a price signal, then prices should surely be permitted to increase to at least cover the increase in input costs that the product incurs as a result of the carbon tax. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me conclude. This is a package of bills which should never have been brought before this Parliament. A specific promise was given by the current Prime Minister during the 2010 election campaign that there would be no carbon tax. That's to say the fixed price of the component of this scheme would not be introduced. So this is a policy for which there is no mandate as I have sought to argue this morning, in addition to that fundamental problem, there are some very serious internal logical inconsistencies in this scheme.